It's great to be here with you and welcome everybody. As Scott mentioned, we do a little introduction of some teaching in the beginning, and always I try to pick some topic that's relevant and relevant in my life usually. And what's happening is change, and I guess change is always happening. But I think I have the feeling, and both in my own life and the people I talk to and my clients, that we're kind of waking up after a long period of being locked up in quarantine and having our lives on pause, really. And I think there's some bumps along that road. There's a little bit of agoraphobia with some people, sort of re-engaging, getting back out. Other people can't wait to get back out, and they're maybe jumping the gun a little bit. So I think we're all dealing with change and kind of wondering what the new normal is going to be. You know, and after thousands of hours in Zoom, what's Zoom going to look like in our lives? As we move out and start to meet face to face again. So I want to talk a little bit about change and embracing change, and just some tips that we can use to manage, as that seems to be the one constant, of course, in our life is change. The first thing I'm going to borrow from Jack Canfield, and he has this cute little equation that's similar to cognitive behavioral therapy, I guess, but it's E plus R equals O. And that stands for E is the event, an event in the world, a pandemic, a war, a famine, a pipeline, terror incident, injury of a friend, whatever the event is, that plus response. So the response, how do we respond to this? What do we make of this? How do we interpret it? What does this mean? What meaning do we ascribe to this for the world, for our friends, for myself? And those two things together, the event and the response, that equals the outcome. You know, how am I going to work it? How is it going to be? How is it going to affect my life? But the critical piece here is that it's not the event itself. The event itself is an event. It's the world doing what the world does. But it's what we make of it, I think, that really goes a long way toward how we deal with it, how the outcome is. It's framing it or reframing it. It's the response. It's our thoughts about it. It's our beliefs about it. It's our thoughts and beliefs about ourselves. It's our understanding of what level of control do we have in this. How does this response match my values, and so on. So my point with that little simple equation is that events inherently don't dictate a certain response. It's how we interpret them, how we manage them and respond to them. That equals the response. So that said, I just want to run through some I think universal tips for managing change, which is all around us. The first thing I think is to really evaluate the level of control we have over the situation, right? And in many ways, this is a serenity prayer, where we look at, okay, I can control this, I can't control that, and that wisdom to know the difference, knowing where we need to put our efforts and where we need to kind of surrender and move more into acceptance. And that level of control is really important, because it's very frustrating sometimes if we just assume we're totally powerless in a situation. And sometimes we are. But very often there are things we can do, if only with ourselves. So there may be an event in the world that I have no control over changing over, but what I do have control over is how I respond to it. If I'm responding from fear, am I responding from faith or trust? You know, what input am I framing this with? And that's going to really help. I think what I know as a therapist working with people, the more we can take control of a situation, the less anxiety we feel. And so very often, even a situation where there's so much going on that we feel we have no control over, what do we have? We can control how we respond. We may want to make lists of how we behave or what we can do to manage it. We may want to take actions to beef up our nurturing time, doing the things we love to do, maybe a little more meditation time. Those kind of things we can control. And I think it's really important to evaluate that and put our efforts into things we can control. The next and very important thing in all this is self-care. Very often when we get overwhelmed by events or disturbed by events, we start to focus on them. And addicts particularly, and I think their partners probably, start to really, we have the ability to obsess and to really focus. I think we can sort of take stuff and run with it. And very often that's fear-based. You know, we fear and we jump to conclusions. And that's my third one, is some cognitive errors, but just this inability to kind of manage by focusing on the external, not really taking care of ourselves. So it's really worth making sure we get the sleep we need. Let's eat those good meals. Let's not take time to skip good nutritious food. Let's exercise. Let's drink properly. Let's stay connected to people. The other thing we do when we're feeling some anxiety or feeling overwhelmed, we start to disconnect, and that can be very problematic for people. So the third thing is what I gave a hint at before. Those patterns of thinking, what therapists call cognitive errors or cognitive distortions. And there's some really common ones. One, when we're confronted with change, oftentimes we resort to black and white thinking. Okay, what does this change mean for me? And black and white thinking means we narrow this down to two usually false choices. It means I have to either do this or that. And we lose the ability to see gray in the middle and to see that there's probably many other options that we could take, but we're not actually in touch with. So I think to really avoid those cognitive errors of black and white thinking, catastrophizing, taking an incident and saying, my God, this is it, this is the end, this is actually a disaster, and really kind of running with it long before there's any evidence that that's the fact, and prematurely so. So really kind of staying in the present is going to be really important. But catastrophizing, black and white thinking, overgeneralizing, this based on one incident, oh, this happened, this always happens, it always happens to me. We often personalize these changes in the world. Jumping to conclusions. There's all kinds of these cognitive distortions that I think are really important to catch ourselves in, because all they do is upset us and give us kind of a false picture, and sometimes a falsely oversimplified picture of the world that kind of cuts out where we do have control, where we do have some influence over our lives in that situation. And then finally, just in our thinking, it's not really cognitive error, but to be realistic, to really do some reality testing, to check out, and this is why connections with other people are so important, check out our conclusions about something. What does this mean? What does this mean for me? What does it mean for you? How are you approaching this? I think the more we can share our responses, it normalizes it, and it also is very comforting to see how other people are dealing with it. We can learn, we can share, we can support. So that connectivity is really critical. And then two more. The one is the fourth, staying in the present. So often, and that's hard anyway, of course, right, to stay in the present moment. But it's so easy to get pulled off into the future or pulled back into the past. And so I think, especially with this change going on, we kind of want to figure out how it's going to be, how it's going to sort out. And we don't know. Nobody knows. We don't know what the new normal is going to look like, but we just know that we have today. And we know that we have to learn how to deal with today and take care of ourselves today and be present today and be kind to ourselves today and the people around us. And that's hard sometimes when there's a lot of anxiety, when there's fear. I make a point of turning off the TV news after a certain point, and never before bed do I watch it, and just that kind of stuff. There's input in the world that there's a lot of fear energy and vibrating out there in the world. I think we have to be very mindful of that and not buy into it. The fear is appropriate in certain situations, of course, but when we obsess about it and it pulls us out of our lives, that's a problem. I think we really have to stay solution focused and solution based. And then finally, really to clarify priorities in the midst of all this change, all these confusing messages. It comes down to what's important to me. What are my values? How do I respond to this that keeps me in integrity with who I am, with what I believe? What do I need to do? Does that mean stepping up somehow and using my voice in some way, or doing service somehow, or being just a friendly listener to somebody who's really experiencing a lot of pain? Just whatever actions we can take that fit, that are congruent with our beliefs about ourselves and our values and our integrity, I think is really important to. And because when there's a swirl of confusion, as there is with major change periods, we can get lost. It's very confusing because there's so many forces pushing and pulling us. And I think at those moments, it really comes down to our values, our integrity, and who we are to kind of provide the guidance in the midst of all this crazy cross currents. So that's my 2 cents on change tonight. It'll probably change tomorrow. Bad joke. But we do have a lot of issues going on right now. There's a lot of pressure, and I think it really is worthwhile to just kind of focus on real concrete tools we can use to kind of keep us all sane and grounded. So with that, I'll stop. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you, David. It occurs to me that these tips on dealing with change are really good tips on dealing with anything, like any stress or anxiety producing situation. I mean, it has nothing to do with David, everyone, but I have a project that I'm working on, and it's dragging on because somebody's not delivering. And I want to control it, and I can't. I need to evaluate my level of control. I'm carrying a lot of stress. I need to go get a massage. I haven't done it. I've needed to do it for 2 weeks. I have some cognitive distortions. I keep making up stories about why this person is dragging their feet. And, you know, I have no idea what's really going on. And I keep thinking I'm going to be stuck on this project forever. I'm living in the wreckage of the future.
Right. I love that expression. Yeah.
And you know, and I keep forgetting what the real priorities are here. And I'm doing everything wrong. So I'm so glad you sort of inadvertently called me out on my insanity. Thank you. It's just, I'm literally doing all 5 wrong in regard to this situation. And you know, nothing to do with change. It's just a stressful situation. So
yeah, you're right. I think it just, if we can generalize change, what is it? It's a stressful external event, right? And that can be a work situation. It can be a personal situation. It can be something out there in the world. But yeah, these are all very useful in all those circumstances.
Yeah, and I just wanted to ask you about there's another topic that seems to be coming up repeatedly in drop-in groups and just everywhere I am, people are talking about boundaries. And I'm wondering how setting boundaries fits into embracing change and dealing with change. Does that land in any of these 5 or?
Yeah, it's a really good point, because I think really boundaries are tools that help us do a lot of these things, right? I think boundaries to really take self-care, for example, if we're around people that are upsetting for us or some people react. I have a relative that in certain crises just reacts with a lot of hysteria, and it kind of goes and if I talk to this person too long on the phone or anyhow, I start to feel that, you know, hysteria building in me. It's very contagious. And so I'm in certain situations, I kind of limit my time to certain kinds of people. I limit my time boundaries. And I mentioned one, television news. That's a boundary for me, is watching news and really limiting my intake on certain information that's going to be, you know, agitating and activating when I'm trying to soothe myself. So yeah, boundaries, people, places, things, I think. And remember, as we've talked about it in this webinar before, boundaries are to protect us and to really keep us safe. And that's what those are. But I think, yeah, they're very appropriate in this sense. Absolutely.
Yeah, we got a little comment in the chat feature. I think this also applies to what happens when betrayed partners are triggered. And I would certainly agree with that. Even though it's not change, it's stressful situation and these tips.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's a perfect example. I agree.
Okay, we ask us questions, use the Q&A feature. We've got a couple in here already, so we'll take these and hopefully we'll get some more here as we go along. This one, sounds like it's from an addict. Is being triggered when your eyes automatically go directly to women's body parts when you see them, and even if you look away as soon as you realize that. So what is being triggered?
It's a great question. So being triggered is a response to some kind of cue or event, vision, sight, sound. You know, almost anything in the process of addiction can take on some energy that could be triggering for us. So yeah, so it could be a nice looking man or woman, and you see that person. And as we always tell our clients, you know, that we're going to see things and read things and people that are activating for us, that are triggering for us just out in the world. And we can't hide away. We can't shut ourselves away somewhere and never take the risk of being triggered. But the trigger is the response to some kind of cue. In this case, in your example, so a woman's body part when you see them. So you see that you've trained your brain, and through the process of addiction, we train ourselves to really focus in on certain things that are highly activating for us. And many times those are highly personal, and they're sort of universal with, say, in sex addiction, especially where we objectify people, whether it's a man or woman, depending on our orientation, that's a universal. But it's very, addiction, because of the dopamine, is very sensitive to incorporating other kinds of things. So it can be a song, it can be a street, it can be a place, it can be the end of the workday, and it's all this different stuff that can be potentially triggering for. So the trigger is that response, that automatic response, like, oh my God. And we're not responsible for being activated, because we're going to be out in the world. We're going to see things and people that are going to do that. What we are responsible, and you mentioned it, it's and just built in your question, that 3-second rule that we talk about is seeking integrity, looking away and at 3 seconds. And then not only that, but then humanizing that person, de-objectifying them by, we say, reminding yourself that that's somebody's mother or sister or daughter, and so on, just kind of making them a 3-dimensional person as opposed to a body part. But triggering can be very strong, and it's quite profoundly so with these, what I call the intensity addictions, sex, porn, and chemsex addiction, because of the levels of dopamine that are involved. It's really highly stimulating. These are what we call super stimulators. And so our brain is highly sensitized to certain things, more so than other addictions. So I'm an alcoholic in recovery. And early on, I remember kind of being triggered when I saw a bar, okay? But it was like a low-level trigger compared to the high-intensity triggers that go with sex addiction. And there's a lot of work right now on attentional bias and how these things work in our brain. And these are really long-lasting triggers. So I've had clients, meth-using clients in recovery over a year, get triggered with something. In the case I'm thinking of, it was a text message from somebody they'd used with, and it brought this whole thing to life that this person hadn't even thought about in months. But there it was, full-blown 3-dimensional. And so we have to really have profound respect for these triggers with these addictions, because they're very strong. They do fade, but if we give them attention, they kind of retain their vitality. So we need to kind of learn how to manage them, not hang on to them. And when you're triggered, by the way, you don't want to obsess about it. You want to do that, the 3-second rule we talked about. Maybe talk to someone, call someone, talk to someone, give it away, take action to try to release it. We don't want to indulge in it. We don't want to hang on to it, because the more we grab onto those triggers and kind of go for the ride, the little dopamine hit we're getting, the greater the chance we're going to relapse, because that's a downward slope. And the longer you're involved in that process, the more dangerous it is.
Yeah, David mostly talked about external triggers, like things you see.
Thank you, Scott.
There are also internal triggers, thoughts and feelings, mostly feelings. Boredom and anxiety are my two biggest triggers. Boredom is really number one. That's my number one trigger. I feel bored. I want to do something about it. And I'm an intensity addict, so I automatically think about sex, or I'll start to objectify somebody. When the objectification is when I'm looking at a body part instead of a person. That's the simple definition. And then if I don't exercise, some intervention like the 3-second rule, I lapse into fantasy, and that slides forward into ritualization, and eventually I'm going to act out. And that's kind of the cycle of addiction. And then I feel bad about acting out, which kind of takes me back to this feeling emotionally triggered. I'm having an emotion that I don't want to have. So I'm very glad that as soon as you feel triggered, you need to act, because that's when you can stop the cycle.
Right.
So for you.
And it's such a good point, Scott, the internal triggers, because you're right. I was focusing on the externals, and really the best strategy is to avoid them if we can, right? But we can't avoid internal triggers. They rise from within us. And so it's really learning how to manage that and take action to release them and deal with them as fast as possible. Absolutely.
Okay, next question here. I'm learning about the vagus nerve, polyvagal theory, and its function with processing trauma and how it can store emotions in our body. I understand belly breathing, mindfulness, and yoga can help with strengthening the vagus nerves, but less clear on how to release the traumatic emotions from the body. Do you have any suggestions for releasing stored energy? Thank you guys for everything you do. You're very welcome. This is definitely a David question.
Yeah, and this is a great question. Thank you, because um, the more we learn about trauma and how it's affected, the more we understand that it's really embedded in our nervous system. It's, effective trauma therapy to help someone who's experienced trauma can't be just talk therapy, because trauma isn't just a cognitive process. Trauma has a lot of activity in the subconscious world and has like nonverbal activity in our body. It's embedded in our body. I always use an example: if somebody's had a massage, and they may have hit a point where you suddenly find yourself crying or in tears or laughing. Those are little pockets of such energy, emotional energy that's actually held in our body. And so with trauma, a lot of that is stored and does need to be released. You talked about ways to strengthen the polyvagal nerve, and that's really important, but that doesn't necessarily release a lot of the trauma. One of the best ways I do it myself is breath work. Breath work is there's several different forms. It's very structured kind of therapy where you're breathing through your mouth. It's almost hyperventilating. It's kind of scary at first. For about 90 minutes, you have someone that sits with you, but it's a nonverbal release, and it's a release of trauma held in the body. It's incredibly effective. Other kinds of traditional trauma therapies like EMDR have a somatic or a physical component. Other kinds of somatic experiencing, there's a lot of them, but to my mind, a good trauma therapy has a built-in component to deal with releasing some of these physically held energy from the trauma itself. So I think, yeah, you're right on track. I think movement, getting in touch with your body, breath work is wonderful, and working with a therapist. And these are all things that probably you shouldn't do on your own. These are things that really need to be done under the guidance of somebody who's trained to deal with it. Because when you're digging around in trauma, obviously it's a painful experience, and people can have some bad reactions, and you need somebody who's trained to respond to that should that happen. It doesn't usually happen, but it can. And so it's important. But yeah, just your question is important to me because it highlights, it gives me opportunity to say that trauma is not just up here, trauma is held in the body. And a lot of the effective release and healing from trauma involves releasing it from the body. And so most trauma therapies have a physical component that does do that. But it's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, Bessel van der Kolk has a book called The Body Keeps the Score.
Amazing book.
In this stuff, pick that up.
Yeah.
And this is a question for another day, or maybe just sometime when you and I are chatting, David, but maybe EMDR works because it triggers some sort of release without causing the individual to fully re-experience the trauma. I don't know, just a thought.
Oh yeah, that's true. The bilateral stimulation that EMDR works with kind of has a life of its own in the healing and releasing of stuff. In fact, as an EMDR therapist, which I do, very often you're not even asking the details of what's going on, what the person is thinking about or remembering. That's not necessarily important. It's important to release it physically and let the body do the work, not talk it through. So it's a really interesting approach, but yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, the old approach to trauma therapy was talking it through, and everybody kind of had to just re-experience it over and over and over until finally.
Right, and which actually is harmful. Who wants to do that?
Yeah, it was miserable.
Yeah.
So, okay, next question here. We are almost 3 years past D-Day. We've been separated the past 2 years due to continued lying. Disclosure was done in August, but minus my questions. So this is from a Portrayed partner. So disclosure still feels unresolved, and yes, it would. One of the things on my list of unanswered questions is an accounting of all the financial deception. He says he can give me a number, but it would be a made-up guess. I am very detail-oriented and know the money spent came from somewhere. So there would be a paper trail: ATM withdrawals, credit card statements, bank statements, investment account statements, loan documents, etc. Every time I bring up my unanswered questions like this, he gets angry and defensive, saying there is nothing there. Am I being unreasonable? It seems there should be some financial amends. What is a reasonable request? His therapist said disclosure was complete and he is in good recovery. It doesn't feel that way on my end. Thoughts? Lot of text to that.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that experience you've had. Um, I guess based on the history of the disclosure and some things that weren't answered, I guess it kind of sets the stage for this thought that it wasn't totally transparent and useful. So that sort of makes me worry. I do know that one strategy for partners to reclaim a sense of emotional safety to deal with their own trauma is to get information and to find answers and get things on paper and get details, to become detectives, as many partners do. And that is a double-edged sword, right? It does reveal some patterns. However, in my experience, at some point, there's never enough data, there's never enough information to really make you feel satisfied, to think that it's done, to think that this is the end. It's always kind of a ever deepening kind of rabbit hole thing that you can get caught up in. So I think, yeah, I think that having these details is important. I'm not sure there's ever going to be enough to give you the answers you need, but I do think it's worth further discussion. I'm surprised his therapist thinks that, given the nature of the disclosure. But I would work, I hope you're working with a CSAT who has experience in partner trauma, who can probably help you guide this in terms of what's a reasonable question, what's not. Because the whole nature of a disclosure, a formal disclosure, the whole point is to kind of get it all out on the table, provide a clean start, a kind of a firm, good, clean foundation to start the repair work on the relationship. And if there's sort of some faults or cracks in that foundation, or some doubts about it, as there seems to be, it's going to be really hard, if not impossible, to do that repair work that you're wanting. So I would take this to your CSAT if you can, and see, they would know more details of the specifics, and work with them to see what your next step should be, whether to really insist on more detail, or to let it go, or to back off, or what your strategy needs to be. But I just would keep it in the back of your mind that that we need information, we want information, but very often there's not enough information to really make you feel better. Although in this case, it sounds like there's clearly some stuff that doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up. And so in that case, I think it makes sense to kind of pursue it more.
Yeah, I think I'm going to recommend books all day. I put 2 books in the chat feature. One of them is called For Love and Money by Deborah Kaplan.
Great.
It's a great book on financial betrayal, often in conjunction with sex addiction. And then a book on disclosure from Stephanie Carnes called Courageous Love. And I can tell you, in Steph's book, part of disclosure is a financial accounting to the best of the addict's ability. And David hit it on the head. You know, there really is no way to get it down to the penny here. It's always estimates, and addicts spend a lot of time covering up and hiding and lying, and they also cover up and hide and lie from themselves. Most guys, when they do set out about a financial accounting, they're shocked at how much money they spent. They have no idea, because they haven't let themselves think about it. And they just don't remember it, whatever. David already covered it. But yeah, and I just I agree with David. That's not a very good disclosure if you didn't get to all that stuff. Can a spouse put boundaries on where the sex addict can travel, or who they can work for or with as part of their job?
Well, I guess this would be really an individualized situation depending on the circumstance, right? We've had clients where they would have affairs with people at work, where they would travel with colleagues to conferences, colleagues with whom they were having affairs. I mean, so yeah, travel is probably the number one risk for a sex addict in any case. And it depends on the situation with the workplace. So I think it's something to be negotiated with your therapist and your treatment team. But I think in certain circumstances, I can imagine there would be concern and maybe some boundaries about that, just because of history and what's happened. Sometimes we see spouses really wanting to get kind of too firm and overzealous in their boundaries to kind of, again, to seek safety. I understand the motivation for it, but to make sure, and that's sometimes it steps over the line. Sometimes there's a stretch, but I think in this case, depending on history, and I don't know what the history is, but I can in my mind I can make up circumstances where those boundaries could be, considered appropriate depending on what's happened before. Scott, what do you think about that case?
Well, first of all, boundaries. If I'm a betrayed partner and I want my cheating partner to maybe quit his job because that's where he was cheating, I can't force him to do that. What I can do is say, hey, I feel really unsafe if you stay in that work environment where, 3 acting out partners are there. I'd really like you to quit. And if you don't quit, I'm going to continue to feel unsafe, and I don't know that I can stay with you. That's a boundary. It's about me and my feelings and how I will respond if you don't find a new job. For me to say, you have to quit your job or else, that's not a boundary, that's a demand. Boundaries are about me, not you. They're about controlling my behavior, not yours. But there's a lot of confusion about that, and a lot of people will try to control your behavior. What I would say to you is, does your spouse have a point? And if so, maybe you should consider it. You're the one who cheated, you're the addict. Maybe that's not the best environment for you. And when I work with guys, I have advised guys, when their spouses are harping on them to quit their job, and yeah, maybe that's not a bad idea. Maybe you need to start over somewhere else where you haven't slept with half the company. So, try and see it through, I'm going to assume this question came from a male, so I'm going to assume the betrayed partner is female. I might be wrong, but try and see it through your wife's eyes, and have some empathy for her feelings, and take that into account as you make your decision about where you want to work and how much you want to travel for work and who you want to travel with for work. So if you want to save your relationship, you got to put the relationship probably ahead of your job.
Yeah.
If you want to save your job, you might have to put the job ahead of the relationship, but that's, you may not be able to keep both. So that's just a bone to chew on. I'm not saying, I don't know your situation. I'm not saying you need to do one thing or the other, but chew on it and think about it. So I am a betrayed partner. My husband is about 14 months sober and probably about 3 months into what I call true recovery. I'm seeing progress in some areas with him being more present and more open to intimacy, but there are times that I cringe with still experiencing some of his self-absorption. For example, we recently planned a trip to see his daughter and made it a combination for my birthday and seeing some of the plans for her wedding. Whenever he talks about the trip, he focuses on his daughter and the wedding versus my birthday, and it does hurt. I've shrugged it off a bit because I'm seeing progress, but I'm wondering if this is normal, where he's still working through ways he has compartmentalized me, and accepting this because I'm seeing progress versus bringing it up. Oh, I'm wondering if accepting this because I'm seeing progress versus bringing it up is the best option in the long run for me. Thoughts? Good question.
Yeah, so I think this is interesting, right? In recovery, we start to have to learn how to kind of manage and renegotiate and deal with situations as they come up. Sex addicts very often have a lot of narcissistic qualities. They're very self-absorbed. They're very focused on what they want. Sometimes they're entitled. So I don't know how much of that applies here, but I think recovery really is all about learning to acknowledge the other person's feelings, other person's needs, and really start to operate in connection and in a couple, hopefully as a partnership, right, where you're both working together to make the best life you can. I'm glad there's progress. I think that's a really good sign, and I think especially when I see open toward intimacy and being present, that's a really good sign to me, because that's sometimes things we don't see typically right off. I think sometimes people are self-absorbed. I think sometimes people don't understand how they're coming off. And just to give, I guess, him the benefit of the doubt here, I would suggest you guys really beef up your communication, either through couples counseling or just talking. And I would suggest, I always ask my couples to really do a check-in every day, even if it's only 10 minutes, just to kind of see where they're at. But I think this is a totally legitimate situation where you could say, when you behave this way, it makes me feel hurt. When you focus on the one aspect of our trip as opposed to my birthday, it causes me a lot of emotional pain. Just to express your feeling in terms of the action that's causing that feeling, and just talk about it. And I think sometimes people aren't aware of what they're doing. Sometimes they're back in old patterns. Sometimes there's issues that have nothing to do with you, but you'll never know any of that until we can, you can talk about it and communicate with it. So I think that's really what I'd recommend. Just the best strategy is to really kind of work it through, to clearly express your feeling. I don't know. And yeah, I'm glad you're seeing progress. I don't think I would let that interfere with your expressing how you're feeling, right? Just because there's little progress doesn't mean that you can't talk about your needs and feeling hurt. And I think sometimes we think we have to walk around kind of very carefully, or we're going to cause a relapse or something. I think if there's real feelings, they need to be shared, because that's really, I think, ultimately the danger to the relationship is those kind of things that go unaddressed and they just kind of get complicated and continue. So I just recommend really honest talk with how you're feeling and what you're observing, and see.
Yeah, I mean, this is the kind of, I'm an addict, so I'll speak from the addict's perspective. This is the kind of thing that I would develop a resentment about. And resentments are just, they're poison for an addict. It's like me drinking poison and hoping you will die. So if I don't talk about these things, they're just going to fester and get worse. So I'm 100% in agreement with David. Get it out. It doesn't have to be some big, huge argument, but say, hey, I'm feeling a little left out.
Yeah. And, if and these are sometimes hard conversations to have. So if you have a therapist in your life, ask for a session, even if it's your therapist, his therapist, couples, even if you're serving an individual client, occasionally you can invite the spouse in for issues like this. So maybe a third party would be helpful, just to kind of moderate, but to get it out.
Okay. My sexaholic husband says his eyes automatically go to a woman's breasts when he knows she's there. I call this a second look. He disagrees. He also says that he is objectifying both men and women. He told me that Friday, but not his sponsor or CSAT. Can you guys help him and me? Thanks. I feel very helpless. Let me just first say this situation is really common, where the man, particularly in a sex addiction, I'll let David take it from there, but this is not
it is a common situation. And I think sometimes habits are so ingrained, and they're automatic. A lot of, and this is not to excuse it, but there are a lot of things that with training and repeated practice, they become automatic. And so very often that second look, which by the way is extremely disturbing for somebody, if you're having a conversation with somebody, or your husband or wife, if you're the addict, and just, the eyes are all over the place. That's a terrible situation. But I think, to me, I guess I kind of, and Scott, I'd really appreciate your insight too. But it seems to me this is something he can just learn not to do. It's kind of it's like kind of the devil made me do it kind of thing. And I think he needs some practice and I guess self-discipline and courtesy, because I think that's really disturbing and upsetting when it continues to happen. I think we're not automatically wired to do that. So look at a woman's breast when we hear a voice or see somebody. I think that's a learned behavior that in my mind could be unlearned. But Scott, I'm curious.
Yeah, sex addicts develop a habit of viewing everything through a sexual lens. Everything, everyone, every experience, everything. We look at it through these sexualized eyes and thoughts. And it becomes a really, really, really ingrained habit. And it's hard to break. I don't know how far along in his recovery he is. but we have the 3-second rule. I wore a rubber band around my wrist for a good year. I'd snap it every time, I found myself objectifying someone. The 3-second rule is where we turn away, we humanize the person, or we think about the box score from last night's baseball game or whatever, and, just to get our head out of the sexual space. It takes a lot of work. Somewhere around the 2 or 3 year mark, I realized I wasn't objectifying people anymore. I mean, it was just a slow, gradual lessening of in Sex Addicts Anonymous, we call it the lust of the mind. And it just, it's not 100% gone, but it went away slowly. This is the kind of thing that, yes, a CSAT can help with, inpatient treatment can help with. Couples therapy can help you get your feelings out. I don't want to delve too much into objectifying both men and women, except to say there could be 100 different reasons for that.
Yeah.
Some of which might be that he's bisexual, and some of which might not be. It could be trauma related, it could be addiction escalation related, 100 different things, and without knowing more, there's no way to say what's going on. But there's help for this stuff. You can reach out to us, just email us on the contact button and tell Tammy what's going on. She answers all of those emails, and she can guide you toward a higher level of help or different help than you're getting or whatever.
And I do think it's important to encourage him to talk to his CSAT about this.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's essential, because otherwise he's not going to get the help he needs to get through this. And I think this is something that needs to be changed and will change, but if he's not doing anything about it to make a change, it's not going to happen. So.
Yeah, a sex addict can and should stop objectifying, but it's not going to happen overnight. I'll tell you that from personal experience, it's not going to happen overnight. And I was trying really hard, and it took a while. Next question. I'm doing groups on here, meaning sexandrelationshiphealing.com. Great. I need to find a trauma CSAT. Email us, click the contact button, type it in, tell Tammy, as I said, she answers all those emails. You need a trauma CSAT, tell her where you live so she can help you find one in your area. And she will absolutely get back to you. She knows,
yeah.
I think, every CSAT on the planet, pretty much. I'd be shocked if there's any CSATs that she doesn't actually know.
That's true, yeah. And there's plenty out there, but yeah, Ben, and Tammy has the advantage of not just giving you a name off a list, but she can kind of vet the list for you.
Yeah, so. She actually knows these people, and she'll know who's good with trauma. Some CSATs are really good with behavioral stuff. Others are really good with the underlying trauma. It sounds like you need somebody who can help with the underlying trauma. So yeah. Can you explain black and white thinking and how it can negatively impact a relationship? Thank you.
Sure. So I mentioned in my little introduction, black and white thinking. It's one of cognitive distortion, so-called cognitive distortion, meaning it's a way of thinking and kind of misinterpreting the world. And it's a way of oversimplifying, and it can get us into drawing conclusions about something that are inaccurate. So black and white thinking is giving ourselves a false choice. Okay, so I remember a client of mine who was a meth using guy, his sex life was so wrapped up in his drug use, and he was very concerned about what was going to happen to his sex life if he got clean and sober. And his statement to me was, well, here's my choice. I either use drugs and have sex, or you're condemning me, it was the word he used, condemning me to a life of vanilla, boring, or no sex at all. It's like either I party and use drugs, or my life is going to be without sex or uninteresting sex, which is not true, obviously. But that was kind of the choice he made. And of course, what's the logical conclusion? To go and use drugs and sex, because the other side is not very appealing. So what it does, it limits our choice. It's a false choice. And it kind of guides our decisions in one way or the other. What happens, what we need to do is see all the range of options in between, the more realistic options. And sometimes if we're really, in my experience, addicts have a hard time doing that, because they're so ingrained, and these are somewhat a part of denial and the way we conceptualize our disease, and how it's kind of protected and buffered against reality, sometimes we really rely on this black and white thinking. Its impact on relationships is severe because it's going to impact judgments I make about what to do with this relationship. I can never tell my wife anything because she gets hysterical. I can't stay in this marriage because I'll never be happy. It's just these false choices that do impact, and usually the solution for this, by the way, is communication and information. Sometimes let's just talk about this and get a reality check of like what are the real options, how are you framing this in a way that is just doesn't make sense. And so I think, again, communication, very often we need help with that, as I said, and it can be a friend, it can be a sponsor, it can be a therapist, just somebody to do a reality check on this. And often in marriages, I know from doing couples counseling that a wife can tell a husband something and it falls on deaf ears, but if a therapist says it, it somehow gains weight, and vice versa. And so I think just sometimes a therapist or someone in authority uttering those very same words that you've been saying, they might be heard in a way that's different than if you're telling them. But anyway, in any case, the danger there is that it limits the person to all these false choices that do really impact the relationship and certainly how comfortable the relationship feels.
Okay, next one here. I never felt accepted in my youth. Later on, I found acceptance in drugs and even later in life, women. Now I have an amazing and loving wife, but I've pushed her away with my behavior. Why would I push away what I've wanted my whole life? That is this pure sex addict question right there.
Yeah. How long do we have here? Not too long. Yeah, okay, so there's a bunch of stuff in here, right? I never felt accepted in my youth. That's a classic too. Most of us don't feel like we belong, that we ever fit in, that we were worthy, lovable, safe, all that stuff that comes with typically with our childhoods, and that need to escape, and whether through drugs or women, absolutely. And now we feel lucky enough to find someone, we're pushing that person away. I think, in my mind, all of that has to do with the person, with the person themselves, right? Am I worthy of this wonderful, loving wife? Do I really deserve it? I think I've seen addicts sabotage good things because at some level they feel they didn't deserve it, they were unworthy, or if they were going to get found out, the imposter syndrome. So I think it all has to do with how you feel about yourself and your ability to receive love and intimacy from somebody who's willing to give it to you. I think we have a lot of trouble sometimes accepting and receiving as addicts. And so I think it comes down to work on changing some of those old core beliefs that you learned through the experiences of your youth. Then by the core beliefs, I mean those I statements, I'm unlovable, I'm unworthy. And what do we do when we have that kind of wiring? We have strategies to overcome it. So if we don't feel worthy, we may start seeking validation in unhealthy ways. We may start proving ourselves that we're really good in all these kind of ways that don't really mean much. Focus on money, focus on status, prestige, just to kind of prove ourselves because inside we just feel like crap. And so I think really the healing part here is inside you, and learning how to receive, learning how to love yourself, learning where your flaws are, and really working hard to correct those. But I think it's a really classic. Scott's right. This is the kind of the classic dilemma where if you're lucky enough to find somebody, we often mess it up. So do the work, don't mess it up. Be grateful, and move forward in your recovery. I think that's the solution.
Yeah, sex addiction is not about sex any more than alcoholism is about alcohol or drug addiction is about drugs. It's about escape. I feel shame. Usually, shame is always kind of the underlying driver of addictions, or almost always, or anxiety or stress, and I don't like those feelings. And I learned early in my life not to trust other people, because my household growing up was dysfunctional, or I was abused, or I was neglected. I didn't get my needs met consistently. So I learn. Have I frozen or have you, David?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, all right. One of us was frozen. So I've learned to turn to a substance or a behavior for escape rather than actually getting my needs met in a healthy way by turning to people who love and care about me. For me, that pattern started in my early teens and it's carried into my adulthood. It sounds like it happened to you that same way. You found escape, not acceptance, by the way, you found escape in drugs and later in life women. And now that you have this amazing loving wife who would actually be there for you in intimate, vulnerable, loving ways, you're still afraid to turn to that. It's easier to go to drugs and acting out partners. And one of the things I just kind of want to point out here is I'll ask guys, you know, if they, particularly if they've had serial affairs or serial one night stands, are these other women as pretty as your wife? Oh God, no. Are they as smart and funny and interesting? Oh God, no. Why did you do it? I don't know. And it's not about your relationship with your wife. It's about your relationship with your feelings.
Right.
You know, and now you have a chance to really repair your relationship and have that wonderful, intimate, vulnerable relationship with your wife. But there's a lot of work to be done. I'm glad this is from our treatment center. I'm glad you're in treatment now.
There's one other dynamic I'd like to just add to that, and that is sometimes, depending on experiences in our childhoods, we have parental care and attention and love that's inconsistent. And when there's that inconsistency, it really does a number on us because we learn that I can't always trust people. So I'm not going to be vulnerable. I'm not going to open up. I'm not going to receive this apparently loving person because I don't know if she's going to be here tomorrow or next week. There's an inconsistency and a fear, an irrational fear based on old stuff. So again, I think it's healing that old wiring. You know, the old software needs to be updated basically, but it's all an inside job for you for sure.
I'm going to jump to the chat feature real quick, and I'm going to cut to the question part of it. Resources for co-occurring behavioral and substance addictions. David, will you hold your book up again?
Yes, well,
this is the best on co-occurring behavioral and
best one. Lust, Men, and Meth: The Gay Men's Guide to Sex and Recovery. Now, I will tell you, I wrote this book addressing the use of amphetamines and sex in gay men. About 80% of the book is totally universal and applicable to everybody. The case studies are gay men because that was the target audience, but the dynamics of when you start to fuse drugs and sex, they're exactly the same, depending on your gender orientation, and whatever, it doesn't matter. And so I'd really recommend this book. There's not many out there, frankly. There's about to be a newer one because I'm doing one now through Seeking Integrity that is going to be on not just methamphetamine and amphetamines, but all drugs and all kinds of sexual behaviors and all genders and all orientations. It's a more universal book on this subject. There's not a lot of great books out there, I must say. There's more articles sometimes, research articles, but to understand the dynamics, the personality, the interpersonality stuff, I would, although this is a gay book, this is really one to look at for sure.
Yeah, and it is really a universal book. The new book, when it comes out, will be even more universal. And it's the only good book. David's not willing to say that, but I will. And I will also say there are treatment centers that say they treat co-occurring behavioral and substance addictions. If you're going to go to a treatment center, come to us. We actually do it. We have the experts on it, starting with David. And if you go to the wrong treatment center, you're only going to get half of your addiction treated. And this co-occurring issue, particularly with sex and drugs, it becomes fused, and it's just double trouble. And you have to treat both parts of the addiction at the same time, or it's not going to work.
It's totally true. And most treatment centers take the approach, we'll get clean and sober from your drugs and the sex will take care of itself. And you can't tell a sex addict it's going to take care of itself. The behavior's out of control and the addiction just moves around from one behavior to another. So it really takes somebody that understands that dynamic and I'm not exaggerating. We're the only treatment center in the country that I know of that really understands that and does that.
The other two resources are, number one, this webinar, because David's here, and number two, on Tuesday nights, are you still doing?
Yes. So there is a platform called In the Rooms at www.intherooms.com. They host 12-step and other kinds of recovery meetings on Tuesday evenings at 5 Pacific, 8 Eastern. I do a chemsex support group, which is it's not a fellowship per se. We have crosstalk and it's very much formatted like this. But the whole idea is chemsex support, drug and sex recovery when the two are one set of problems. And it's an important place to talk. So many people come there because there's not a safe place to talk about it. You can't talk about the sex part in AA, and if you're in SLAA, they don't want to hear about the drug part so much. And it's a nice place to talk about this fusion that Scott mentioned.
And that's a freebie also.
Also free. You have to create a user login and profile, but it's free.
Free. Take one more question here. How can a betrayed partner deal with a sex addicted spouse that says different things to the marital therapist than what he says later, or he denies it to the spouse right after the session? So things are said in couples counseling that are denied or different after the session.
I guess that's a tough one. You just really need to kind of, I'd confront that in a session and say, last time, we need consistent messaging. And I think you have to have everybody in one room at the same time and point out the inconsistencies, what you heard. And it may mean a tough conversation, but those kind of things really need to be corrected quickly. And so I would just, next time around, point it out, hey, last time in this room, you said this, but as soon as we get out the door, you said something else. What's going on with that? And see where it goes in the therapy session.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what the marriage counselor's for.
Yeah.
To help with that kind of stuff. So,
right.
Thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, David. Great topic today about embracing change. That's way more universal than that. Just like your book is way more universal than this game.
Yeah. Thank you.
Anything you want to say to take us out? No,
just everybody stay present, take care of yourselves, and know the change is coming and never always will. So, yeah. All right. Good night. Take care, Scott. Thank you.